Webinar hosted by the Cloud Standards Customer Council. My name is Tracy Berardi, and I am Program Manager of the CSCC. Today we're going to discuss our latest deliverable, which is a reference architecture for hosting mobile apps in the cloud. We're joined by contributors Roland Barcia, Heather Kreger, and Anshu Kak to discuss the specific components of the architecture along with key considerations. The paper is available for download today. You can download the paper at the URL at the bottom of the title page that's up on the screen. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you'd like to pose a question, please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar toolbar. This afternoon, we will post the presentation to the CSCC website, and I'll also send you an email with a direct link.
And this one is the mobile application architecture for cloud that has just been recently published, and the link was provided. So in this presentation, we're going to actually go over what are cloud solution architectures, why do we care, what are the candidate architectures that we're working on in this series, and what's coming next. We're going to go through in great detail about this particular architecture for mobile, and then looking at some mobile open source projects that actually support the various components and capabilities that are in this architecture. So Tracy, next slide, please. So cloud customer reference architectures are really very straightforward, high-level descriptions of the elements needed to implement a particular solution or application in a customer's business environment or your business environment. And in particular, implementing these applications using cloud infrastructure, platforms, cloud software, and cloud services. So these applications these architectures are deployment neutral, so you should be able to deploy any of these components in a public, private, or hybrid manner. You should be able to implement them using infrastructure, platform, or software as a service. So they're very flexible as far as what's the right way for you to implement this technology in your particular environment with your requirements. They are general purpose and they're reusable architectures. We look at being able to compose them, so we should be able to compose, for example, the mobile architecture along with web application and use these things together. This is vendor neutral and this is an open architecture. So why is it important to have these high-level architectures that map very simply to cloud computing? Well, they really enable customers to understand exactly what these new domains are, so what are the mobile components, and then which ones apply to cloud, and what are the caveats for using cloud computing, and what are the benefits of using cloud computing to support these architectures. They help bridge a gap between customers and providers as far as this architectural role, and it helps customers understand what providers are talking about and gets everybody on the same page as far as customers being able to ask providers about what the level of support they have and what components and capabilities that they have to support these various architectural elements. These are stable sort of starting points, so we won't update these papers very often. So that gives people something that they can sort of refer to and gives them a jump start in learning these new domains. They're useful when you're starting to do new work. They're very important for developers, managers, and architects to use as a starting point into a new domain. In particular, when they're applying a domain even they might know already, cloud computing. And it's consistent with these existing reference architectures that the industry's been working on. Next slide, Tracy. Thanks. So I said there was a series, and here's the current vision of what that series might be. So we've already published the web app posting. There's the date there, and the mobile one is the one we're talking about today. We have actually already submitted big data and analytics architecture, and the work groups are working on that already. We hope to do something around security as well as integration, social computing, and DevOps. We are also thinking that there's a set of industry architectures which are not as composable and reusable as these general architectures are, but industry architectures around commerce and finance, travel and healthcare, and that will just really depend upon the customers engaged in the CSCC and what's interesting to them to move forward on. So, given that background, I'm going to turn it over to Roland Barcia, our CTO for Mobile First, to walk us through the architecture.
Heather gave a good background around, the cloud computing reference architecture and the importance of going through and using cloud computing, especially in a space like mobile, where you have instant feedback channels for how your app performs, how well its usability is, and therefore this notion of two-speed IT is critical for mobile capabilities and people moving mobile backends and mobile workloads from a mobile app into the cloud. And so when we say mobile apps, we know mobile apps run on devices. It's a core component. This could be extended to omni-channel and wearables and such from a mobile perspective. And so the important thing to kind of think about here are what are the core capabilities needed from a mobile backend perspective. And so we focused on some key capabilities in the enterprise, knowing that there is a slew of other capabilities that surround this in the mobile space from an entertainment perspective, from an ecosystem perspective that are related and integrate, but we're focusing on these capabilities. And the importance of discussing capabilities is core because as I interact with customers, but it's important to talk about capabilities with your customers that drive the business value, and from there you might get into, what is the best provider or a mix of providers for these capabilities. So if you progress to the next slide, we really focus on some core capabilities around mobility, and we saw the categories of those capabilities, and here we have a relationship between them. Obviously on the left-hand side, we need E-type applications, so these are applications for employees of a corporation. They have a level of control that they need over the devices and integration with mobile device management, and so usually there's some type of agent either within the app wrapper, within the device, that's controlling things and providing security. And when I talk about the MDM component, I'll get into that. And of course, things like offline capabilities as well, because when we're dealing with responsive mobile applications, offline capabilities is a core use case because you're dealing with areas that you might not have connectivity, you might be working offline, you might be in a dead zone, and so when we talk about a provider, right, we're talking about running the capabilities in the hybrid cloud, and I'm going to go through each of these, but again, the two-speed IT notion is key, and the ability to perhaps even run certain capabilities as isolated microservices that you might need to redeploy, change, and quickly build out. And so next slide. So let's focus now on the app. So the mobile app is a core component, obviously, and one of the things that is important to understand is there's a whole ecosystem in these mobile applications. So we were speaking about the mobile app and the key that vendors provide core enterprise SDKs into their ecosystem, and oftentimes the enterprise services that are provided need to interact with these things. So for example, last week at WWDC, Apple announced some new search capabilities, and it might be that you have to, surface your data through those search capabilities in order for customers to locate enterprise content. And so we want to call this out as a key integration point for the enterprise services. And so, they also provide ways to get access to things like tokens and access to security capabilities on the device. And so you might want to provide the ability to log into your back end using Touch ID. So these vendor frameworks and these enterprise SDKs are going to be key capabilities. And then as I provide capabilities from the cloud, I want to surface them up as SDKs in the appropriate platform. And so from that perspective, it's important to understand the mobile app is key. Next slide. So from a management perspective, right, capabilities into the corporate network, and therefore extra security compliance to secure both the device, the applications that are distributed to those devices, and access to certain internal systems are key. And so capabilities like wiping a device, wiping applications partially, encrypting data that's on the device, and all the policies associated with them are usually distributed through an agent, through a policy, through an app wrapper, and provided by a mobile device management provider that we'll talk about shortly. Next slide. And offline capabilities are key from a mobility standpoint. It's important to understand, in lieu of what I just said on the management agent, that applications are storing more data on the devices themselves. They need the ability to sync this data to different backends, to different providers, and perhaps the ability to store that in an encrypted fashion. And so offline capabilities is a key scenario, because some of the services that surface up from a mobile provider perspective deal with the notion of syncing in offline data. So next slide, please. Okay. The other core capabilities is the fact that interactions from a mobile perspective are going to go through DNS services and content edge services, firewalls, load balancers. Sometimes these services are implicitly provided by a cloud provider. Sometimes they need to be configured in an infrastructure as a service level. And depending on the type of applications you're building, if you're building 5.9 quality apps that are distributed across single tenants, cloud providers, across different data centers, you need ways to externalize and load balance and have firewalls across data centers. And so the edge services are key capabilities. And then oftentimes many applications will cache content out in CDNs, out in the cloud. And because the closer you cache to the user, if you can't store from an offline device perspective, the next best place is on the edge. Next slide, please. And we talked about the notion of SDKs and interaction with the mobile provider, and the mobile providers also have their own network and communications to the devices, and oftentimes in the enterprise we will interact with those mobile providers. And so, for example, many of us have apps that receive push notifications from different backends, and those push notifications are delivered through networks for Apple APNS or Google Cloud Messaging. And you're going to have to interact from your mobile backend to those providers to send messages through that channel. There's other services provided by the mobile provider as well. And so interaction with the mobile provider network, again, is a key capability that needs to be thought of when you're building out enterprise apps. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get into some of the areas from a mobile gateway perspective. Your entry point into the provider cloud is key. And oftentimes, it's important to have a single place or a single point of entry for applications to come in. And there's different services a mobile gateway provides, right? Normally, when I build applications either directly or through SDKs interact with APIs. And these APIs are provided by some implementation, third party, or can be provided by the very mobile app developer. And these APIs might be implemented in a PaaS layer where you have different backends, different systems running in a polyglot environment, running in different virtual machines or different processes or different servers. And so having a single entry point where you can apply security policies, where you can enforce authentication, where you can capture analytics and provide reverse proxying capabilities to the back end gives you a level of control that's necessary for enterprise applications. And so the mobile gateway is a core entry point into systems. Next slide, please. Next, this is probably one of the core services when we talk about mobile backend as a service. What are the core application services provided by a mobile backend? The ability to write code, maybe using different sets of programming languages, whether it be Node.js, Java, Ruby on Rails, and the ability to integrate core services for those applications. So for example, many mobile applications are content aware, context aware, and you need location services. Or you need to be able to sync data from an offline storage into a data service. Or you need the ability to send push notifications out to the provider networks. You need perhaps a set of operational analytics where you're capturing not just service invocations, but things that are happening on the device. What OS made the request, what scene or screen were they on in the mobile app, what are the characteristics of the application, what's the session, what are the security implications of that user information, session information, etc. And then a slew of app security capabilities in addition to things in the gateway. So for example, you might provide a service that detects that the original app deployed in the App Store has been tampered with. Someone decompiled the app, repackaged it, reposted it to a third-party app store, and someone got a hold of a fake version of your application. And so these are examples of security services in a mobile backend. So the core here is you're building out applications and you need runtime services and access to key mobile services in your mobile backend. These seem to be the standard set of services. If you look across multiple vendors and open source, you see a very consistent set of services around data sync, analytics, push notifications, locations, and security services out of the box. Next slide, please. Thank you. Mobile device management, again, a core capability, and usually for business to employee or business to business applications, where a corporation or an entity might have a bring your own device, or they might standardize on a specific set of corporate devices or a single vendor like iOS and distribute tablets to their employees. And with that comes the need for mobile device management as a core capability. Mobile device management obviously says it manages, devices for a corporation. It installs policies and security for those devices, so that if an employee loses a device, I might need to wipe a device or partially wipe a device or block all access to the network from that device as a security policy. It might also integrate services into the email system of a device, so installing policies that dictate certain email security capabilities. It can capture device analytics, and in many cases, employee-facing applications are not surfaced in the public app stores, and therefore it will provide app distribution services either in a pull perspective in your typical app store pattern, or even pushing key applications that are required for an employee to a device. And so mobile device management is a core capability that's required from the cloud from a mobile perspective. Next capability, next slide. We call out the category of mobile business applications. And these mobile business applications might use the other services as implementations. But we see the emergence of higher level applications that are surfacing their capabilities through microservices and incorporated into your mobile backend. So for example, proximity services, we see the emergence of things like iBeacon and the collection of information based on where a user is. So whereas a mobile backend might collect information about location, you might have a set of services that you can push that information to and provide key analytics of that information, like location heat maps and things like that of a store floor plan. Campaign management services, so we see the use of sending through push notifications or through passbook coupons or store loyalty cards, and within an application doing certain campaigns.
And so campaign services is another example. Workflow services, business analytics services, etc., are a set of higher level capabilities that in itself might be built with other services you see here in the ecosystem. But at its core, they're integrated and expected experiences that are required for mobile ecosystems. So it's important to kind of remember that you're going to be interacting more and more with different levels of business applications as examples. Next slide, please. API management we call out as a core and required capability from a perspective of mobile. And that's because as you're writing mobile backends, you're writing APIs that are surfaced to mobile apps. These APIs become reusable, they become versioned, they become thing endpoints that you need to get analytics against. And so API management is a core capability. In reality, everything you built out in a mobile backend might need to be surfaced in a catalog, for example, where a third-party developer might need to go in, look for a particular API, or download an SDK wrapping that API, get an API key that represents a trusted relationship between API consumer and API producer. And so API management and the ability to manage, version, and surface these APIs is a core capability from that perspective. Next, please. Data and mobile data is huge. And the fact that we're needing to write responsive apps, and these apps are, especially in enterprise, are a collection of data that might exist in your system of record back in your data centers, combined with a wealth of information that exists from a system of engagement perspective. Data that comes maybe from your social network, from your usage patterns, from your mobile device. We're seeing the emergence of the ability to have identity managed by a third party. And so, the ability to store data closer to users and in front of your mobile backends without having to go back to your data centers is a core capability. And because of the two-speed IT notion, the notion of the different types of apps or the different types of backends and data formats, we're seeing that data that's closer to the user needs to be less structured. And so there's different formats of mobile data, from NoSQL databases such as CouchDB or Mongo, where you're storing JSON data, which is the format that many apps use as transport and storage on the device for application data. The use of file storage as well is a key capability where you're storing content and files and PDFs and all sorts of things. And of course, caching services, where you might cache system of record data or data from different locations in a staging area. And so data services are huge from a mobile perspective, and you should look at that as a core capability provided by your mobile backend. Next slide, please. Security services are important because obviously with enterprise, the ability to protect your infrastructure, to protect your data, to protect your customers' data, to protect things in your data center require all sorts of services. Identity and identity management is its own space, where you might be dealing with proprietary identities within an enterprise network in data centers, combined with having to manage identities that you might have in third parties, and the emergence of things like OAuth, using your social network perhaps as a source of identity. You need to be able to interrogate that, to understand that, and perhaps map that to identities in the back end. And so ID and access management as a core service, and usually externalized from the different services, is a core capability. Data protection, of course, cannot be underscored. And of course, policies, the ability to configure policies and security intelligence on how your different services are accessed, how data is protected, how things work on the device. And so security services are key capabilities, and we've identified, data protection, ID management, and security intelligence as a core sub-capabilities there. Next slide, please. So when you're dealing with enterprise systems, I think one of the core problems that exist is how do you get data from many years designed differently in back-end systems into mobile apps that are consumable, usable, and in a performant manner. Many years in the enterprise of people building ESBs, fronting tons of hosted systems, usually in a bottom-up fashion using data formats such as canonical data models that represents all their backends, contain a superset of data that might not be relevant to the end user and different from the data model that mobile apps are bound to. And so the ability first to connect to the enterprise, either via gateway technologies that exist in the enterprise or through VPN, the ability to call into back-end systems through integration technology, and the ability to filter, aggregate, or modify data is going to be really a core capability when you're surfacing up enterprise data into the cloud. And usually the delays in projects and slowdowns in mobile initiative is key, and this is really the role that serves as the bridge between the two-speed IT problem, where back-end and enterprise systems usually evolve much slower than mobile apps need to, and therefore, this bridge and this key that lives in both worlds is going to be a core capability required. Next slide, please. Most of the time when you're building enterprise applications, there's going to be an enterprise user directory provided by an enterprise who has a set of users and a set of information about users. How that user information surfaces to the cloud, either through connectivity and being bound to a runtime in the cloud, or perhaps more likely you have an enterprise app such that interfaces to that directory and provides a service such as login or something like that. And so there's usually an enterprise user directory that needs to be thought of. Next slide. Access to enterprise data, so systems of record and transactional systems, data warehouses. I talked about that from a connectivity standpoint. And so accessing data and re-representing data in the cloud for applications, again, core capability. And then next slide. And so enterprise applications, so there's not just the data, but there's going to be years of many applications that might have logic, business rules, and such that need to be reused or re-invoked. And so therefore, you have to take that into account from a cloud solution architecture. We're living in a hybrid world when you're building enterprise apps and you have data behind firewalls in data centers mixed with data in the cloud. Next slide. And so to kind of summarize here, right, a good cloud provider usually as platform as a service, and I'm not going to go through the differences between that. Heather talked earlier that core capabilities can be deployed differently, whether you have bundled platforms running inside containers or VM images in an infrastructure as a service pattern, or whether you have microservices running these subcomponents as individual services that I compose together in a platform as a service. A good mobile provider will provide a set of different mobile services that can be consumed and brought together to create new and interesting applications, and work with the mobile provider to do that. And so what we, hopefully we've given a good summary, and definitely you could send emails and things to us if there's other capabilities that we're seeing emerging out there, because a reference architecture, especially in such a evolving space as mobile and IoT, are going to continue to evolve. So it's a living work. And we need that feedback and that perspective across the industry. Next slide, please. And so this slide represents what I just talked through, so that you can have a picture of, as you look at the overall core capabilities, you have a deeper dive and details to the core services that each category contain. And so, for example, I talked about the mobile backend, and you see how I mentioned app logic, API implementations, the operational analytics, push notifications, data sync location, and app security are the core capabilities of a mobile backend. So this is a good pictorial representation of the different sub-services that exist in each area. Next slide. And so what I'm going to kind of conclude here is, in the white paper, we kind of discussed a scenario where we mapped the capabilities needed, and we chose a mobile banking scenario that many banks have implemented, where you're depositing a check through taking a picture. In the paper, we discuss the steps around when I install the application and I opt into a particular service. When I launch the application, I'm going to log in and I'm going to exercise going through the mobile gateway, going through security services to establish that identity. I'm going to interact with the mobile app and some of the provider services when taking a picture. I'm going to deposit that check along with some additional information, and I might use some of the data services to store the images as well as some data as a staging area, because I might not want to let the end user wait till I have it all stored in my own data centers or systems of record. So I might return to the user and say, we've got your check, we're processing. In the meantime, I've interrogated that data in the mobile backend, storing things with mobile business applications, perhaps grabbing some of the analytics around that, calling backend services through the transformation and connectivity layer. The backend systems, the systems of record, might run its business rules, its business, return back success, in which case the mobile backend would send a push, would store the state in the data services and send a push notification back to the mobile app that your check has successfully been deposited, and then they can go through the mobile app, through the security channel, and access the status and the result of that. And so these services are all being interacted, the ones in color, in this particular use case. And there's many other use cases that you can think of. And so the paper kind of walks through that scenario. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Anshu, and she's going to walk you through an example mapping. We did a few mappings across different vendors, both commercial and open source. Over here, since we're talking in general around a kind of open ecosystem, she's going to walk you through some of the mappings around open source technology. So go ahead, Anshu.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Roland. Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. So as Roland mentioned, these various different capabilities. In this slide, what we are doing is taking the capabilities and mapping them to the open source technology. Coming from left here, as far as the mobile app is concerned, where you are seeing Apache, where we talked about the frameworks and enterprise SDKs. So mapping to the open source, there is Apache Cordova, there is jQuery, there is Swift. And what are these? These are the frameworks that lets the developers create the Android apps or iOS apps and have a standardized set of JavaScript libraries for these OSs. Coming now next to the next level is the public network, where it is the edge service where you enter, where we talk about the domain name system, we talk about content delivery network, we talk about firewall, load balancing, And some are provided by the cloud providers, and some are here which we have as the comparison to the open source, whether it is the Cloud Foundry Fast Router, or we have the Vayata, we have the OpenStock network, LBAS. So these are some of the open source elements we have in the edge services. Coming to the next level, that is the mobile gateway, and this is where the entry takes place, and we are talking about authentication, policy enforcement, or API reverse proxy. Here we have the user grid, Apache, and the BAS box. Now, BAS box is, you will see it in various different capabilities where it is in mobile gateway, mobile backend, in API management, because the BAS box has the functionality which is has the user management, has content management, has API management, push notification, a little bit of even database management. So that is where the user management aspect of the BAS box takes place. Then if we go and get to the device, mobile device management and the security services that are provided, here we have WSO2, which is very much policy-based security services provided. So that takes care of the security aspects as far as the policy-based security is concerned. Going more towards the right, we are talking about mobile backend. And here you see the BAS box, Helios, and Apache user grid. Again, Helios is another extensible open source mobile backend framework, which is being used today in the industry. Provides essential backend services for iOS apps, for Android apps, from data synchronization and push notification to the passbook integration, as Roland talked about how the passbook integration works, and it's built on the Rack Web Service interface and can be easily added into the Rails or Sinatra applications. So here we are talking about Helios and BAS box. So there are some functionality you can use either from BAS box or from Helios in the mobile backend. Going more towards the right are data services, and we know that from since 2006, 2007, there has been this huge push towards the NoSQL databases like the MongoDB, like the CouchDB, Postgres, and then also in the OpenStack has given us the object store through Swift and the block storage through Cinder. So all these are taking care of the data services as far as the NoSQL is concerned, and the object and the block storage databases is concerned. On the top, we talk about the API management. Again, API is very much and three open source. We have Apache user grid. We have BAS box and Helios. As I said, that these BAS box and Helios are really a lot in this performing in putting the mobile architectures together using open source. And last but not least, the user directory, as we have to connect to the user directory, the LDAP directory. So it is the enterprise user directory, I should say, whether it is Open LDAP or it is the Backgrid also has a user directory, and OpenStack Keystone user directory. Now, one of the slides which I liked from Roland, which was about the path, the whole center box is path. So here you see the path is Cloud Foundry. So you can build using microservices, and build composable mobile applications. And you can use Cloud Foundry as the base and build those services and connect the services and put applications together. And for the auto scale, there is OpenStack orchestration, which is based on heat. So this is kind of where we are talking about how the architecture that we talked, that Roland talked about, how it is connecting to the open source support, and what do we have in the open source world to implement these architectures. Going to the next slide, please. I think we're at the end of the call. So the call to action is join the CSCC now. I think it is very, very helpful that as an industry, if we put the cloud standards and we are conformed to those cloud standards, because cloud is taking the market and we have to interoperate. And until and unless there are not those standards, we as customers and we as even the providers, vendors will face a lot of problem in future. So I joined the cloud standards and learned about this organization. The membership is free, and get involved with the working groups. It's fun to work in them. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Anshu. It's Tracy. Yeah. Oh, hi.
Over to you, Tracy. Yeah, it's just the additional resources.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. Thank you so much, and thank you also to Roland and Heather. This next slide, as you were saying, is a list of other white papers that the CSCC has published, and you can find these on our website. When you go to cloud-council.org, there's a resource hub page where all of our papers are posted. I should also mention in the chat box in GoToWebinar, we posted a link to the white paper, and immediately following today's webinar, we'll post the presentation slides and a recording to our site. So I'll be sending an email to everyone with that as well. Let's see. So we have a couple of questions in. Take a look. First question. Does anyone have any first-hand experience with customers that have used reference architectures? Roland, Heather, or Anshu?
So yeah, I mean, all the time when I work with corporations, reference architectures are really, especially large organizations, a way for which they can bring some consistency across the different projects they might be running. And so the larger the corporation, the more likely that they have a reference architecture. And from my perspective, reference architectures don't have to be big, scary things, right? They could be, listing out the capabilities that are needed, and then using that to drive, what are the physical topologies needed, what are the network configurations needed, what are the application services needed, what are the approved SDKs, et cetera, needed. And so reference architectures are used fairly frequently in the world I operate in as we look to adopt capabilities across different projects.
Thank you. And what additional cloud architectures are expected to be delivered this year? I know we mentioned the big data analytics. Were there others?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So the other cloud architectures, as Heather mentioned, we are using getting out with the big data analytics. We are getting out with DevOps, and we already have published, working on, and will publish the cloud-enabled data center for the CSCC. Heather, you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, we have a whole set plan for a set of architectures that we'd like to see come out. So big data analytics we talked about is already submitted, and you can help us with that one. We're thinking about doing some security ones in addition to complement the existing portfolio here at the CSCC. DevOps, we're hoping will come next, followed maybe by social, and then starting to look at some of the industry work.
Great. Thank you. Next question. What are some of the pros and cons of open source offerings versus commercial offerings? Do we have any thoughts on that?
So I can make a couple statements. I think there's different pros and cons to both approaches, but in general, right? Open source is a good way to get started with capabilities because they're usually readily available. Some of them are better documented than others. You can start using individual capabilities at once and get going quickly. I think over time, right, what I've seen is, depending on, the effort or the number of months or years, right, you build once and you maintain constantly. And so I've worked with corporations where they've become basically, even though they might provide a line of business like insurance or banking, they become also integrators of all different sorts of open source working together, and they've had to build out their own tools and maintain those tools while employees go in and out of that ecosystem. So the whole notion of having to be a system integrator across different open source technologies is probably the con. And from a commercial perspective, you usually have to adopt some sort of platform, which might be a learning curve up front, but at the end they might have these integrations between the different components pre-built. So that tends to be my experience in that.
Great. Let's see, our last question. We have a few minutes. Is privacy a major concern for mobile cloud providers?
Yes, privacy is. I think why we see certain enterprises still host backends in their data centers is because of the notion of data and being secure, right? There are certain standards, banking, PII, PCI, and others are almost required. Healthcare, HIPAA compliance. These sort of things tend to eliminate things like multi-tenant cloud in favor of single tenant. And then, how much do you trust that single tenant cloud to host data? And so choosing the right provider with the right SLAs and the right agreements and the right trusted relationships is key to moving, certain workload for certain types of data in the cloud.
Yeah, and to add to Roland's comment, very well said, there are three aspects where you need to look into data. Sometimes we concentrate too much on the authentication authorization only. There is manage access, which is important. Then there is protect the data. How are you going to protect the data that is going over the wires? And the third is gain visibility. Gain visibility meaning how you can preempt from any of the attacks or cyber threats that you have, and how can you take care of that? So all these three aspects of security are important in these architectures.
Yes, thank you, Anshu and Roland. Actually, one more question came in. Is the mobile application offloading a part of your architecture? Mobile application offloading?
So I guess I'm trying to understand the question and what you mean by offloading, because so from a perspective of, if you mean app distribution, we talked about the apps being distributed through an enterprise app store, for example, in B2E scenarios. Apps run on devices, and so managing versions of those through the cloud. We talked about workload, so taking the back-end services the apps talk to and offloading that workload in the cloud. So I'd probably need a little bit more context around that question.
Yeah, I can send a separate note to him afterwards. I think that's all we have for right now. But sure, we can continue that after the webinar.
Okay.
So yeah. Great. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. Again, we'll post the presentation and recording this afternoon to the CSCC website. I'd like to invite you all to attend our future events. And as additional reference architectures are published, we'll make sure to ping you on them so you can stay up to date. And thanks again, Roland, Heather, Anshu. I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.